I remember the exact moment my name stopped belonging to me. It was a quiet afternoon, yet the air felt unbearably heavy, like something unseen had already decided my fate before I could even speak. My mother wouldn't look at me. My father kept his voice steady, but his hands trembled against the wooden table, as though he was signing away something far more valuable than land or coin. They said it was necessary. They said it was the only way to settle what had been hanging over our family for years, a burden whispered about in corners and silences. I wasn't asked. I was simply told. Told that I would be handed over as part of a long-standing obligation, a binding agreement that had outlived reason, compassion, and perhaps even justice itself. I remember thinking it was a mistake. Surely, they meant something else. Surely, there was another way. But no one corrected it. No one stopped it. And in that moment, I realized something far more terrifying than fear itself. I realized I had no place in the decision that would define the rest of my life. They said the man I was being sent to was different. Not cruel. Not violent. Just unknown. And somehow, that made it worse. Because cruelty has a face you can prepare for. But the unknown? The unknown swallows you whole. I had heard stories about arrangements like this. About women who disappeared into them and were never truly seen again. About households that felt like quiet prisons, where voices faded and identities dissolved into duty. I wondered if that would be me. If I would slowly forget who I was, or if the world would simply forget me first. But what I didn't know, what no one told me, was that the man I was being handed over to would not become my captor. He would become something far more dangerous. Something no one could have predicted. Because in a world built on obligation and silence, he was the first person who ever looked at me like I had a choice. And that was where everything began to unravel. And everything began to change. My name is Alara Whitcomb. I was born in the early years of the 19th century, in a quiet English countryside village, where traditions carried more weight than truth, and reputation mattered more than happiness. It was a place where people knew your family history before they knew your name. And in my case, that history was not kind. My father had once been a respected man. A landholder, modest but proud, known for his fairness and careful dealings. But one failed agreement, one miscalculation, and everything began to crumble. Debts in those days were not just numbers written on paper. They were chains. Invisible, yet inescapable. They wrapped around families, pulling them down slowly, until even dignity became something you could no longer afford. I grew up watching that decline. Watching our home grow quieter. Watching my mother sell pieces of her past, just to keep the present from collapsing entirely. And watching the way people began to look at us differently. With pity. With judgment. With distance. But I was not like the others in my village. That much was clear from a young age. I asked too many questions. I spoke when silence was expected. I dreamed of things beyond the narrow paths laid out for women like me. And perhaps that was my greatest flaw. Because in a world that valued obedience, curiosity felt like rebellion. And rebellion had consequences. By the time I turned 19, the whispers had grown louder. She is too strong-willed. She will bring trouble. No man will want a woman who does not know her place. I heard them all. Every word. Even when they thought I didn't. But what hurt the most was knowing my family had started to believe them too. I became less of a daughter, and more of a problem that needed solving. So when the final notice came, when the debt reached its breaking point, it didn't take long for the decision to be made. Not because they didn't love me, but because love, in that moment, was not enough to outweigh survival. And so, under the weight of tradition and desperation, a choice was made. I would be given away to fulfill a legal obligation tied to my father's past. A living resolution to a financial burden. A human answer to a written agreement. And just like that, my future was no longer mine. I was no longer Alara Whitcomb, the girl who dreamed beyond her circumstances. I became something else. Something defined not by who I was, but by what I represented. A price. A solution. A sacrifice. And I was about to meet the man who would change everything I thought I understood about all of it. But not in the way anyone expected. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Not because time slowed, but because every moment carried the quiet weight of what was coming. No one spoke of it directly. Yet everything changed. My mother began folding my clothes differently, as though preparing them for a journey she refused to name. My father avoided my gaze, choosing instead to speak to the walls, the windows, anything that would not remind him of me. I became a presence people walked around, not with anger, but with guilt. And guilt, I learned, can be colder than cruelty. The village, however, was not so gentle. Word travels quickly in places where there is little else to occupy the mind. They began to talk. Softly at first, then louder. She is the settlement. The family couldn't recover, so they handed her over. Such a shame, though perhaps it was always meant to end this way. I passed them in the streets as they whispered. Sometimes they didn't even bother, lowering their voices. As if I had already left. As if I no longer existed among them. But the worst part was not the whispers. It was the way people began to treat me with a strange kind of final kindness. Shopkeepers who once ignored me now offered small smiles. Neighbors who barely spoke to me now greeted me with careful politeness. It felt like they were saying goodbye, without ever admitting it. And with every passing day, I began to feel something shift inside me. Not fear. Not yet. Something heavier. Something quieter. Resignation. I stopped arguing. Stopped questioning. Stopped hoping someone would change their mind. Because deep down, I knew they wouldn't. I knew the agreement had already been sealed long before I was told about it. And I was simply its final piece. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man awaited me. Was he old? Cold? Indifferent? Would he see me as a burden? Or worse, as nothing at all? I tried to imagine his face, but every image blurred into the same emptiness. Because I realized something terrifying. It didn't matter who he was. The outcome would be the same. I would arrive, and whatever I had been before would no longer exist. One evening, I overheard my parents speaking in hushed tones. My name slipped between their words like something fragile. "She will be safe," my mother whispered. My father didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice sounded distant. I hope that is enough. Hope. That was all they had left to offer me. Not certainty. Not protection. Just hope. And as I stood there, unseen beyond the door, I realized something I could not unlearn. I was not being sent away because they believed in a better future for me. I was being sent away because there were no other options left. And in that realization, whatever part of me had still been holding on, finally began to break. The morning I left, the sky was unnaturally clear. No clouds. No wind. Just a stillness that made everything feel deliberate. As though the world itself had paused to witness what was about to happen. No one from the village gathered to watch. But I could feel them. Behind windows. Behind doors. Observing quietly, as they always did. A carriage waited outside our home. Simple. Unmarked. Final. My mother adjusted my coat with trembling hands, smoothing invisible creases, as though perfection might somehow soften the reality of what she was doing. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. My father stood beside her, rigid, his expression carved from something I could no longer recognize. Pride, perhaps. Or regret. Or both. "Ilara," he said finally. "Just my name. Nothing more. No explanation. No apology. Because what words could possibly make this right?" I stepped forward without being told. Because what else was left to do? The driver opened the carriage door without a word. Even he seemed to understand that silence was more appropriate than any form of acknowledgement. As I climbed inside, I felt something shift again. Not in the world, but within me. A quiet acceptance. Not of what was happening, but of the fact that I could not stop it. The door closed behind me. And just like that, my life, as I had known it, ended. The journey itself was long. Too long for thoughts, yet not long enough to escape them. Every mile carried me further away from everything familiar, and closer to something I could not yet understand. When we finally arrived, it was already evening. The estate stood at a distance, larger than I expected, but not grand, not in the way I had imagined. There was no display of wealth, no unnecessary decoration, just structure, order, silence, the kind of silence that felt intentional. I stepped out of the carriage slowly, my eyes adjusting to the fading light. And then I saw him, standing at the entrance, waiting. He was not what I expected. Not older, not frail, not imposing in the way I had prepared myself for. He stood still, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, they did not look through me. They did not dismiss me. They did not reduce me to what I represented. They simply observed, as if trying to understand something. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, something inside me shifted again. Because for the first time since this began, I felt uncertain in a different way. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I couldn't predict him. And that was far more unsettling than fear. He stepped forward slowly. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Measured. Deliberate. "Ilara Whitcomb," he said. My name. Spoken clearly. As though it still mattered. I didn't respond immediately. Because I didn't know how. And then he said something that no one had prepared me for. Something that broke every expectation I had built to protect myself. "You may enter," he said quietly. "On your own terms." And in that moment, everything I thought I understood about my fate began to unravel. I stood there longer than I should have. His words echoed in my mind, repeating themselves as though they carried meaning I could not yet grasp. On your own terms. No one had ever spoken to me like that before. Not in this context. Not when my future had already been decided without me. It felt misplaced. Almost like a mistake. Because what terms could I possibly have? I had been handed over under a binding agreement. A legal resolution shaped by desperation and tradition. There was no space for choice in such arrangements. And yet, he spoke as though there was. I felt something stir inside me. Suspicion. Confusion. A fragile, dangerous flicker of hope. But I crushed it quickly. Hope, in situations like this, could be more harmful than despair. It could trick you into believing in something that would never come. I had learned that already. Still, I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me. Not with ownership. Not with indifference. But with a kind of restraint, as if he were holding something back. And that unsettled me more than anything. Because restraint suggested intention. And intention meant there was more beneath the surface. I took a slow breath, my fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of my coat. If this was some form of kindness, I did not understand it. If it was a performance, I did not trust it. And if it was something else entirely, I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. What does that mean? I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped aside, creating space between us. A silent invitation. Not a command. "You are not confined here," he said after a moment. His tone remained calm, almost careful. "But you are bound by circumstances neither of us created." Bound. The word settled heavily in my chest. It was the truth. The only truth that mattered. I wasn't free. Not really. No matter how gently he chose to present it. And if I choose to leave? I asked. The question felt bold, almost reckless. But I needed to hear his answer. Not for escape, but for understanding. He met my gaze fully then. No hesitation. "No one will stop you from walking away from this house," he said. A pause followed. Subtle. Measured. "But the world beyond it may not offer you more mercy." And there it was. Reality. Unsoftened. Unavoidable. He wasn't trapping me. But he wasn't pretending either. This arrangement, this historical contract, had already shaped the outcome. Leaving wouldn't undo it. It would only change where I faced its consequences. I looked past him, toward the estate behind those doors. A place I did not know. A life I did not choose. And yet, it was the only place that acknowledged my presence with something resembling honesty. I felt the weight of the decision pressing against me. Stay, and face the unknown within. Or leave, and face the unknown without. Neither offered safety. Neither offered certainty. For the first time since all of this began, the choice, however small, felt real. And that made it heavier than anything I had endured before. I took a step forward. Not out of trust. Not out of surrender. But because I needed to understand what kind of man would speak of freedom in a world that had already taken mine away. And as I crossed the threshold, I realized something quietly, almost reluctantly. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. The inside of the estate was nothing like I had imagined. There was no overwhelming display of wealth. No excessive decoration meant to impress or intimidate. Everything felt intentional. Simple. Ordered. Quiet. As though every object had been placed with purpose, rather than pride. He closed the door behind us, the sound echoing softly through the hall. I turned slightly, aware of his presence, but unsure how to navigate it. Silence stretched between us. Not awkward, but uncertain. "I am Rowan Hale," he said finally. His voice was steady, grounded. A contrast to the storm of thoughts moving through my mind. I nodded once. I know. Of course I knew. His name had been spoken many times in my home. Always in hushed tones. Always with weight. But never with clarity. Now, standing before him, he felt less like a figure of obligation, and more like a question I did not yet know how to answer. "You must be tired," he continued. "There is a room prepared for you." Prepared. The word caught my attention. Not assigned. Not arranged. Prepared. As though care had been taken. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. "I did not know what you would prefer," he added. So I chose neutrality. There was something almost unfamiliar in the way he spoke. Careful. Measured. As though every word had been considered before it was given. I followed him down the corridor, my footsteps quieter than his. Or perhaps I only imagined it that way. The walls carried no portraits. No family history on display. Just space. And silence. "Why?" I asked suddenly. The words slipped out before I could stop it. He paused. Not abruptly. Just enough to acknowledge the question. "Why what?" he asked. I hesitated. Because I wasn't sure how to frame it. "Why are you different? Why aren't you treating me like what this agreement says I am?" But those words felt too heavy to speak aloud. "Why are you like this?" I said instead. It was vague. But it was all I had. He considered the question for a moment. Not dismissing it. Not avoiding it. Just thinking. "Because I did not choose the terms," he said finally. "And neither did you." Simple. Direct. But it carried more meaning than I expected. We reached a door at the end of the corridor. He opened it without hesitation, stepping aside to let me enter first. Again. That space. That choice. The room inside was modest, but warm. A bed. A window overlooking the fields. A small table. Nothing excessive. But nothing lacking. "I will not force familiarity," he said from behind me. His voice remained calm, distant yet present. "You may take the time you need." I turned slightly, studying him more carefully now. There was no expectation in his expression. No demand. Just patience. And that unsettled me in a way I could not explain. Because I had prepared myself for control. For indifference. For something I could resist. But this quiet respect, gave me nothing to fight against. And without something to fight, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. "Thank you," I said, the words unfamiliar on my tongue. He nodded once. No smile. No reaction. Just acknowledgement. And then he turned to leave. But before he stepped out, he paused. "If you need anything," he said, "you only have to ask." The door closed softly behind him. And just like that, I was alone. Not confined. Not watched. Just alone. And for the first time since I had arrived, I realized something I hadn't expected to feel. Not fear. Not anger. But curiosity. Because the man I had been handed over to was not behaving like a man who believed he owned anything at all. And that made him far more dangerous than I had prepared for. The first few days passed in careful silence. Not the suffocating kind I had known before, but something lighter, almost deliberate. As though space itself was being offered to me, rather than forced upon me. Rowan did not intrude. He did not appear unannounced or demand conversation. Yet somehow, his presence lingered in quiet, unexpected ways. A book left on the table. Fresh water placed by the window each morning. Small, thoughtful gestures that asked for nothing in return. At first, I ignored them. Not out of ungratefulness, but out of caution. Kindness, I had learned, often came with conditions. Even when those conditions were hidden beneath soft words and careful actions. But days turned into a rhythm I could not deny. And slowly, my defenses began to shift. One evening, I found him in the garden. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the ground. He stood near a row of untrimmed hedges, sleeves slightly rolled, hands marked with soil. It startled me, not because of what he was doing, but because of how ordinary it felt. "You tend this yourself?" I asked, my voice breaking the quiet. He looked up, not surprised to see me. "Yes," he replied simply. There was no pride in his answer. No attempt to impress. Just truth. "You could have someone else do it," I said. A pause. Then, a small shift in his expression. "I could," he admitted. "But I prefer to understand the things I am responsible for." Responsible. The word lingered. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't control. It was something else. Something I wasn't used to hearing in this context. I stepped closer, my eyes tracing the uneven lines of the garden. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, unpolished, alive. Most people would see this as beneath them, I said. He glanced at the soil on his hands. Most people, he said quietly, spend their lives trying to appear above things they do not truly understand. There was no arrogance in his voice, just observation, and something about that unsettled me, because it felt honest. Days later, we spoke again, and then again. Not long conversations, not deeply personal, just small exchanges that slowly built something I could not yet define. He never pressed, never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. But when I spoke, he listened, fully, as though my words held weight, as though they mattered. And that was new, dangerously new. One afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I found myself sitting across from him in the study. A book rested open between us, unread. "Do you resent them?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard, not because of its content, but because of its timing. I didn't answer immediately, because I didn't know how. Did I resent my family? The ones who had given me away under a law they could not escape? The ones who had chosen survival over me? I don't know, I said finally. The truth felt heavier than any lie. He nodded once, as if that answer was enough, as if uncertainty was allowed. And in that moment, I realized something had changed. I was no longer just existing in this place. I was beginning to feel seen, not as a solution, not as an obligation, but as a person. And that terrified me more than anything before, because being unseen is painful, but being seen means you have something to lose. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment I could point to and say, that was when everything changed. Instead, it unfolded slowly, quietly, like something growing beneath the surface, unnoticed until it was impossible to ignore. I began to look for him, without meaning to. In the mornings, I noticed when he wasn't in the garden. In the evenings, I found myself listening for the soft rhythm of his footsteps in the corridor. It was subtle at first, then undeniable, and with that realization came something far more dangerous than curiosity. Attachment. One evening, we sat near the window, the sky dimming into soft shades of grey. The room was still, the kind of stillness that invites truth without forcing it. "You could leave," he said suddenly. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something I hadn't heard before. I turned to him slowly. "Why do you keep saying that?" I asked. "Because it remains true," he replied, "no matter how circumstances may feel." I studied him carefully. "You know I can't," I said. "Not with anger. Not with frustration. Just reality. The world outside this place," I continued, "it would not welcome me differently." He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, because he knew. "And yet," he said quietly, "I do not want you here because you have nowhere else to go." The words settled between us, heavier than anything spoken before. "Then why do you want me here?" I asked. It was the question I had been avoiding, the one I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer to. He didn't respond immediately. For the first time since I had known him, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of care. "As yourself," he said finally, "not as what this arrangement requires." Something in my chest tightened, because no one had ever separated those two things before. I had always been defined by what I represented, what I was expected to fulfill. But he spoke as though there was a version of me beyond all of that, a version that still mattered. "That may not be enough," I whispered. The words felt fragile, exposed. "It is enough to me," he replied. And there it was. Not a confession. Not yet. But something close. Something undeniable. I looked away, my thoughts unraveling faster than I could contain them. Because this was not part of the agreement. This was not something I had prepared for. To feel seen was one thing. To feel valued was another entirely. And to feel something in return, that was dangerous. Because love, in a world like this, was not freedom. It was risk. It was vulnerability. It was the one thing that could break you more completely than anything else. And yet, as I sat there, beside the man who had every reason to treat me as less, but chose not to, I realized something I could no longer deny. I was already falling. Slowly. Quietly. But completely. and I had no idea what it would cost me in the end. It did not take long for the outside world to notice the shift within these walls. Silence, after all, has a way of drawing attention, especially when it replaces expectation. Visitors began to arrive. Not often, but enough. Men dressed in formal restraint, their words measured, their eyes sharper than their smiles. They did not come for conversation. They came for confirmation. Of the agreement. Of its execution. Of me. I was no longer invisible to them. I became something to observe. To assess. To question without asking directly. She has settled well. One of them remarked one afternoon, his voice carrying quiet implication. Rowan did not respond immediately. She is not a condition to be evaluated, he said calmly. The man's smile tightened. But she is part of a binding resolution, he replied. And such matters require clarity. Clarity. The word felt cold, like a reminder of what I was meant to represent. Not a person, but a conclusion. After that day, the atmosphere changed. Not between Rowan and I, but around us. Letters began to arrive more frequently. Sealed. Formal. Heavy with expectation. I saw them on his desk, unopened for longer than necessary, as though delaying them might somehow delay what they contained. But delay is not escape, and we both knew it. One evening, I found him standing by the window, the last letter still in his hand. Unread, or perhaps read too many times. They are asking questions, he said quietly. I didn't need to ask who they were. The same people who had shaped this arrangement. The same system that had decided my fate without ever meeting me. What kind of questions? I asked. He exhaled slowly. The kind that require answers neither of us wishes to give. I felt a chill settle beneath my skin, because I understood what that meant. They were not interested in how I felt, or how I was treated. They were interested in whether the agreement had fulfilled its intended purpose, whether the terms had been satisfied. They will come, he added. Soon. The word lingered. Soon. Not distant. Not avoidable. Imminent. And when they do? I asked. He turned to face me fully. There was something different in his expression now. Not uncertainty. Not hesitation. But tension. We will have to decide how to respond, he said. We. The word should have brought comfort. But instead, it brought weight. Because it meant this was no longer just his responsibility. Or mine. It was ours. And whatever decision was made would not remain contained within these walls. I realized then, what we had been building in quiet, careful moments was not protected. It was fragile, exposed. And now, it was being seen by a world that did not believe in things like choice, or connection, or love without condition. And that world was coming closer, with expectations we could not ignore, and consequences we could not yet see. The night before their arrival, the estate felt different. Not quieter, not louder, but heavier, as though every wall understood what was about to unfold. I couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of certainty. Something was about to change, irreversibly. I found him in the study, as I often did when thoughts became too loud to contain. But this time, he wasn't reading. The room was dim, a single candle casting shifting shadows across his face. You should rest, he said without looking up. I could say the same to you, I replied. A small pause. Then finally he looked at me. And in that moment, I knew, whatever had remained unspoken between us would not remain that way for much longer. They will expect an answer, he said. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it. Something breaking through. Not just about the agreement. He stopped, as though the next words carried more weight than the first. But about us. Us. The word no longer felt uncertain. It felt real. Defined. Dangerous. There is no us in their eyes, I said quietly. Only terms. Conditions. Outcomes. I am not concerned with their perspective, he replied. His tone shifted. Not louder, but firmer. And what are you concerned with? I asked. It was a question I needed answered. Not as part of this situation, but as part of something far more personal. He stepped closer. Not abruptly, but with intention. With the truth, he said. The space between us felt smaller now. Charged. Unavoidable. And what is that? I whispered. For a moment he said nothing. And in that silence, everything we had not said, everything we had carefully avoided, rose to the surface. Then finally, "You are not here because of an agreement," he said. "You are here because I chose not to let that agreement define what this becomes." My breath caught slightly, because I understood what he was saying, but I needed to hear it fully. "Rowan," I began, but he didn't let me finish. "I care for you," he said. No hesitation, no retreat. The words landed with a weight that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Not as an obligation," he continued. "Not as a responsibility. A step closer. But as you." My chest tightened, my thoughts unraveling. Because this was the moment everything changed. "You shouldn't," I said softly. "Not as rejection, but as truth. This was never meant to be." "I know what it was meant to be," he interrupted. "And I am choosing something else." Choice. The word echoed louder than anything else. Because in a world that had taken mine away, he was offering his. Freely. Without condition. "And if it costs you everything?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "Then it was never mine to keep." Silence followed. Heavy. Full. Final. And in that moment, I realized something I could no longer deny. This was no longer about survival. This was about something far more fragile, far more dangerous, and far more powerful. Love. And once spoken, there was no returning from it. Morning arrived too gently for a day that carried so much weight. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The words spoken the night before lingered between us. Not awkward, not uncertain, just present, real in a way neither of us could ignore anymore. We moved through the house differently, not distant, but aware. Every glance held meaning. Every silence felt shared rather than empty. And for a brief moment, the world outside ceased to matter. We walked the grounds together that afternoon. No urgency, no plan, just quiet steps along familiar paths that suddenly felt new. "I used to think this place was just structure," he said. I glanced at him. "And now?" I asked. He looked ahead, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. "Now it feels like something worth protecting." The words settled gently in my chest, because I understood what he meant, and I understood what he didn't say. We spoke more freely that day than we ever had before. About small things, meaningless things, and yet, somehow, they felt more important than anything else. Because they were ours. Unwritten. Unforced. Chosen. At one point I laughed. A real laugh. Unrestrained. It startled me, because I couldn't remember the last time I had allowed myself that kind of ease. He noticed. Of course he did. "You should do that more often," he said. "Laugh." "Yes." I shook my head slightly. "It feels unfamiliar." "Then perhaps that is reason enough," he replied. There was no pressure in his tone. No expectation. Just a quiet hope. And for a moment, I allowed myself to believe in something I had long dismissed. Peace. Not permanent. Not guaranteed. But present. We sat beneath a tree as the sun began to lower. The air cooled, carrying the scent of earth and distance. I leaned back slightly, my gaze drifting toward the sky. "This won't last," I said quietly. Not to ruin the moment, but because truth demanded to be spoken. He didn't argue. Didn't deny it. "I know," he said. A pause. "But that does not make it less real." I turned to him then, studying his face as though trying to memorize it. Every detail. Every line. As if preparing for a future where memory might be all I had left. And in that moment, I made a choice. Not about the world. Not about the consequences waiting beyond these walls. But about this. About us. I allowed myself to feel it fully. Without restraint. Without fear. Even if it was temporary. Even if it would be taken away. Because something within me understood. That moments like this, rare and fragile as they are not meant to be denied. They are meant to be lived. Completely. And for the first time since everything began, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I had found. And how much it would hurt when it was gone. They arrived just before dusk. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But with a presence that shifted the entire atmosphere the moment they stepped onto the grounds. 3 men. Dressed in formal authority. Their expressions composed, their movements deliberate. They did not knock. They were announced, as though the house itself understood the weight they carried. I stood at the top of the stairs as they entered, unseen, unacknowledged, but not unaware. Rowan greeted them in the main hall. Calm, controlled, But I could see it now, the tension beneath his stillness. "Mr. Hale," one of them said, "we trust the arrangement has been fulfilled." Fulfilled. The word echoed through me like something sharp and unyielding. "I do not consider it in those terms," Rowan replied. His voice remained even, but firmer than I had ever heard it. The men exchanged glances. Subtle, measured, unimpressed. "That is not how such matters are defined," another said. The agreement was clear. Clear. Simple. Final. They spoke as though I were not there. As though I were an object within a contract, rather than a person standing just beyond their sight. And in that moment, I understood something fully. To them, nothing had changed. Not my presence. Not my voice. Not my life. Only the outcome they expected to verify. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. The sound of my movement drew their attention instantly. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Assessing. Calculating. Detached. "So this is her," one of them said. Not unkindly, but without warmth. Without recognition. As though confirming the existence of something listed on paper. I felt the weight of their gaze press against me. But I did not look away. "This is not a matter for inspection," Rowan said. He moved slightly closer to me. Not possessive. Protective. A distinction they did not seem to acknowledge. "On the contrary," the first man replied. "It is precisely that." A silence followed. Heavy. Unforgiving. "We have received reports," another continued, "indicating that the nature of this agreement has not progressed as intended." Progressed. Intended. Words that stripped everything down to expectation and outcome. "And what exactly do you believe was intended?" Rowan asked. There was no hesitation now. No restraint. Only quiet defiance. The men did not answer immediately. Because they didn't need to. The answer was already written. Already assumed. Already decided. And in that moment, standing there, under their gaze, I realized something with terrifying clarity. What we had built here, what we had allowed ourselves to feel, was not just fragile. It was unacceptable. To them. To the law. To the very structure of the world we lived in. And they had not come to understand it. They had come to correct it. And suddenly, that brief moment of peace we had held on to, felt like something already slipping through our fingers. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Not because the walls moved, but because the weight of expectation pressed inward, leaving no space for hesitation. The men stood firm, their presence unyielding. Rowan did not step back. And I stood between 2 futures neither of us could avoid. "This matter will be reviewed," one of them said. His tone carried the quiet authority of something already decided. "Unless it is corrected now." Corrected. The word struck deeper than any accusation, because it implied that what existed between us was wrong, unacceptable, something to be erased. "There is nothing to correct," Rowan replied. His voice did not rise, but it no longer held restraint. It held conviction, a dangerous thing in a world built on compliance. The men exchanged another glance. Short, knowing. "Then you leave us no choice," the first one said. "There are consequences for failing to uphold such agreements." Consequences. The words settled heavily in the air. Not just for him, but for me, for my family, for everything connected to this arrangement. I felt it then, the full weight of the situation. This was not just about us. It never had been. It was about law, expectation, reputation, and the fragile balance that held society together. A balance we were now threatening to break. "Ilara," Rowan said quietly. I turned to him, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw uncertainty. Not fear, but the awareness of what this choice would cost. "This decision cannot be undone," he continued. His voice softened. "But it must be made." The moment stretched. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. I could walk away, return to what the world expected of me, allow the agreement to be fulfilled as intended. It would restore order, silence the questions, protect those who had already given so much to survive. Or, I could stay, stand beside him, defy everything that had shaped this moment, and face whatever came after. Not alone, but together. Neither choice was without loss. Neither offered safety, but only one felt true. I stepped forward, not toward the men, but toward Rowan, and in that movement, everything became clear. "I will not be reduced to a condition," I said. My voice steadied as the words formed. I will not allow my life to be defined by an agreement I did not choose. The silence that followed was absolute, unbroken, final. And I will not leave, I finished. The decision was made, not out of defiance alone, but out of something far stronger, something that had grown quietly between us. Choice. And once spoken, it could not be taken back. The air shifted the moment the words left my lips. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet finality that could not be undone. The men did not react immediately, but I saw it in their eyes. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was refusal. You understand what you are declaring, one of them said slowly. It was not a question. It was a warning. Yes, Rowan answered before I could. He stepped forward, his presence no longer restrained. She has spoken for herself, he continued. And I stand with her. The statement landed with quiet force. Not aggressive, not desperate, but certain. And certainty, in that moment, was the most powerful thing in the room. The men straightened slightly, their posture shifting from observation to action. Then you both place yourselves outside the protection of this agreement, another said. Outside its terms and its allowances. I felt the weight of that immediately. Protection. Allowances. Things I had never truly understood until now. And now, we were stepping beyond them. Knowingly. Willingly. That is understood, Rowan replied. His voice did not waver. Not even slightly. A long silence followed. The kind that feels like the edge of something irreversible. Then, without another word, the men turned. No argument. No raised voices. Just departure. As though the outcome had already been recorded. And there was nothing left to say. The door closed behind them with a quiet, final sound. And just like that, the world we had known was gone. I stood still, my breath uneven, my thoughts catching up to what had just happened. It felt unreal. Too fast. Too absolute. They won't return, I said softly. It wasn't a question. Rowan looked at me. No, he replied. But what follows will. I understood. This was not the end of the conflict. It was the beginning of its consequences. And yet, despite everything, I did not feel regret. Fear, yes. Uncertainty, of course. But not regret. Because for the first time in my life, a decision had been mine. Not shaped by expectation. Not forced by circumstance. Mine. Rowan stepped closer. Not urgently. Not cautiously. Just enough to close the space between us. You should know, he said quietly, that whatever comes next will not be easy. I met his gaze. I know. A pause. Then softer. But it will be ours. And in that moment, standing in the quiet aftermath of everything we had just risked, I realized something that no law, no agreement, no expectation could take away. We had chosen this. Together. And whatever came next, we would face it the same way. Not as obligation. Not as condition. But as something far more powerful. As two people who refused to let the world decide who they were allowed to be. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Without the constant weight of expectation, the house felt alive in a new way. Every corner, every hallway, seemed to breathe with possibility instead of obligation. Rowan and I moved through the routines differently now. Not as partners in arrangement, but as allies in life. We shared tasks once tedious and now meaningful. Tending the garden, reading aloud, repairing what had long been neglected. Even the smallest tasks felt charged with significance. I no longer feared his presence. Instead, I felt a tether of trust, unspoken but unbreakable. We spoke freely of dreams that had seemed impossible before. Of travel, of distant towns, of books we might write, and lives we might lead. The world beyond the estate no longer felt hostile. It felt distant, but navigable. We began to receive letters less frequently. Some were inquiries from those who had overseen the agreement. They questioned, they pressed, but the weight of our choice had shifted something in their approach. They no longer assumed compliance. We responded calmly, carefully, each reply a subtle assertion of autonomy. Outside obligations existed, yes, but they no longer defined us. I discovered strength I had never known. The kind that comes from surviving more than just circumstance. It comes from choosing your own path. Rowan often observed me quietly, his eyes reflecting pride I had rarely seen. And in those moments, I realized love was not just tenderness or connection. It was courage. Courage to defy expectation. Courage to trust. courage to continue when the world demanded compliance. We began to entertain visitors of our own choosing, friends, scholars, and neighbors who respected us as equals. No one questioned why I was here. No one assumed what my role should be. And for the first time, I truly believed in a future where my decisions shaped my life. The estate no longer felt like a place of restriction. It became a home, not because of walls or law, but because of choice. And in that home, I felt something I had never known: belonging. Not temporary, not conditional, but real. We had reclaimed our lives. And in doing so, we had built something neither law nor expectation could ever undo. I was free, not from the world, but within it. And alongside Rowan, I finally felt whole. Years passed, yet the memory of that night, the decision, never faded. The estate flourished, as did we, though not without challenge. Our defiance became a quiet legend in the county, a story whispered among neighbors, of a young woman who refused to be defined by a contract and the man who stood beside her. Scholars and travelers visited to study how law and choice collided in our story. We documented the estate, the gardens, even the letters, preserving proof of what could be done when morality and courage intersected. The children we raised learned of integrity first, then kindness, then the strength to make choices that might unsettle the world, but align with their hearts. Rowan taught them responsibility, not as duty, but as commitment to self and others. I taught them empathy, not as a convenience, but as power. The outside world continued its rigid expectations. Yet our family grew, not in defiance alone, but in example. Neighbors began to challenge their own assumptions about law, loyalty, and what it meant to respect choice. And slowly, quietly, our story inspired subtle shifts in societal expectation. Not revolution, not upheaval, but the recognition that people, women especially, could exercise will, even within a strict social contract. Our legacy was not measured in wealth or power. It was measured in courage and quiet transformation. I often walked the gardens alone, watching sunlight spill across the flowers we planted. And I remembered the fear I had carried, the isolation, the uncertainty, and I marveled at how fragile choices, once seized, could ripple outward. Even the neighbors who had doubted me once now treated me as a figure of dignity, not condition. We wrote letters and journals documenting the estate, the challenges, the victories. Future generations could read, could learn, could understand. A person's worth is never determined by circumstance, by law, by expectation, but by the choices they dare to make. And in that knowledge, we found peace. Our names were not just remembered, they became symbols. Symbols of agency, of courage, of love that refuses to bend to force or fear. And in that legacy, I found fulfillment deeper than I had ever imagined. Because the life we built was ours alone. I remember the last evening I spent with Rowan before everything shifted again. Not in turmoil, but in quiet reflection. We sat by the hearth, the fire flickering shadows across our faces. His hand found mine, not out of necessity, but instinct. And in that small touch, years of struggle, defiance, and love seemed to settle into something permanent. I thought of the girl I once was. The one handed over to settle debts she never incurred. The one who felt invisible, voiceless, and bound by law. And I saw her now transformed. Not untouched by pain. Not free of fear. But unbroken. Rowan's eyes met mine, steady and unwavering. "You've become remarkable," he whispered. I felt tears threaten to fall. Not from sorrow, but from recognition. Recognition of survival, courage, and the depth of connection that had grown between us. For a moment, we were silent. No words could capture the years, the tension, the choices. No words could hold the weight of what we had endured. And yet, that silence was enough. We didn't need declarations. Not anymore. Because every glance, every breath, every heartbeat spoke the truth of what we had shared. I leaned into him, not seeking protection, but offering partnership, acceptance, love. And though the world outside our walls remained harsh and judgmental, inside, we had built a sanctuary. It would not last forever. Time is relentless. But what we had carved together, trust, courage, choice, would remain. Even as years passed, even as life carried its inevitable sorrows, that night would endure. A reminder of how far we had come, of what it had taken, and of the love that had emerged from fear, from expectation, from everything meant to control us. I pressed my hand to his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath my palm. And in that rhythm, I found both ending and beginning. The girl who had been given away once now held a life fully her own. And she was not afraid anymore, because she had chosen it. And in that choice, she had found everything. Our story is more than a tale of historical circumstance. It is a testament to the strength of choice, the courage to defy expectation, and the power of love unbound by obligation. Even in the strictest social contracts, even when the world prescribes our roles, we have the ability to define ourselves. The girl who once had no voice became a woman who shaped her destiny. And the man who could have conformed chose loyalty, integrity, and love. Their story reminds us, resilience is forged not in comfort, but in adversity. Choice is not always safe, but it is always ours. And love, real love, demands courage. If this story moved you, reflect on it in your life. What expectations have you inherited? Which decisions are truly yours? Comment below with a choice you've made that changed everything. Subscribe for more stories that explore courage, love, and defiance in the face of history. And share this story, because courage, once seen, can inspire others to find their own.